Two of the largest submarines ever built are rusting at a pier in the Russian Arctic, missile hatches wide open. Not by accident, by agreement, so that American satellites can look inside and confirm that they are empty. They are called the Typhoons. By displacement, the largest submarines in human history, a record that still stands. 48,000 tons underwater, 2.5 times an American Ohio. A machine so vast, its crew had a swimming pool, a sauna, and, for a while, a cage of songbirds. No enemy ever defeated them. No torpedo ever touched them. No storm ever sank them. And yet, of the 6 that were built, 3 were cut apart for scrap. And it was America that paid for the cutting. This is not a story about how big they were. Everyone tells that story. This is the story of how they died. Why did the most powerful submarines ever built starve to death with their reactors still fueled? What was it like to live inside one, under the polar ice, 4 months at a time? Why did their funeral arrive as an invoice, paid in dollars? And why, in 2009, did thousands of Norwegians photograph a giant glowing spiral in the night sky and blame a UFO? It begins with the Soviet Union being afraid of an American machine. Chapter 1. The Answer. In the early 1970s, American engineers began work on a new class of missile submarine, the Ohio, and a new missile to arm it, the Trident. 24 launch tubes per boat, quiet, deep, and very hard to find. In Moscow, the conclusion was automatic. Whatever the Americans built, the Soviet Union would have to answer. In December 1972, the requirement landed on the desk of a man who had spent his whole life answering. Sergei Kovalyov, the son of a naval officer of the old Imperial Fleet, the chief designer of the Rubin Bureau in Leningrad, and by then, the most prolific submarine designer on Earth. The Hotel class, the Yankee class, every Delta. Over his career, 92 submarines would be built to his designs. If the Soviet Union had a ballistic missile submarine, Kovalyov had drawn it. But this time, his problem was not the Americans. His problem was the missile. The new Soviet missile, the R-39, used solid fuel, a technology where Soviet chemistry lagged years behind. To match the range of a Trident, the R-39 had to be enormous, 16 meters tall, 84 tons, 90 with its launch capsule. Nearly 3 times the weight of the American missile it was answering. And the monster barely worked. In the early test campaign, more than half of the first 17 firings failed. First stage failures, second stage failures, the chronic curse of Soviet solid fuel. The engineers would beat the problems out of it eventually. From the submarine itself, nearly every launch succeeded, and in 1984 the missile entered service. But remember the pattern. A missile arriving late, heavy, and troubled. It will end this story. 20 of those had to go to sea, hide under the Arctic ice for months, and survive whatever the Americans threw at them. No existing submarine could carry them, so Kovalyov's bureau stopped designing a submarine and started designing a building that could dive. They considered over 400 design variants. What they chose had never been built before, and has never been built since. Not one pressure hull, 5. 2 main hulls lying side by side like a catamaran, with the 20 missile silos standing in the space between them, forward of the sail, in 2 long rows. A steel cathedral, with the missiles as its columns. The 2 main hulls were joined inside a single outer casing, divided into 19 watertight compartments, and sheathed in some 800 tons of rubber, an anechoic skin to swallow the sound of sonar. Between the hulls, besides the missiles, the designers tucked in 3 more sealed capsules, one for the torpedo room, one for steering, and one for the men who would give the order, the command module, buried in the safest place on the ship. The numbers stopped meaning anything. Nearly 175 meters long, stand it on its tail, and it would look down on a 50-story building. 23 meters across, wide enough that sailors compared walking its passageways to walking through an apartment block. 48,000 tons submerged. To this day, the heaviest submarine ever built. So much reserve buoyancy that the fleet's own sailors mocked it as the water carrier, until they understood what the buoyancy was for, smashing upward through 2.5 meters of polar ice. To build it, they reconstructed a shipyard. At Sevmash, in the closed Arctic city of Severodvinsk, rose Hall 55, the largest covered shipbuilding hall in the world. 432 meters long, 2 cranes of 330 tons each, more than 1,000 Soviet enterprises fed it. In 1977, American reconnaissance satellites photographed something taking shape in that yard, and analysts realized it was not a stretched version of anything they knew. It was new, and it was huge. The Soviets called it Akula, the shark. NATO called it Typhoon, and confusingly, later gave the name Akula to a completely different Russian attack submarine. Then, in 1981, Leonid Brezhnev stood before a party congress and used NATO's word himself. The Americans are building the Ohio with Trident missiles. An analogous system, Typhoon, is being created in our country too. The first boat began sea trials in July 1981, running almost neck and neck with USS Ohio, and the two entered service within weeks of each other at the end of that year. After a decade of chasing, the Soviet answer had arrived, on time. And inside that answer, the designers had hidden something no warship had ever carried: comfort. Chapter 2. The Floating Hilton. Step inside. 160 men, and for once, room for all of them. Small cabins instead of racks, with wash basins, televisions, air conditioning, 2 wardrooms, a separate smoking room so the boat wouldn't marinate in it, a gym, a solarium to fake the missing sun, an oak-paneled sauna, and the detail every sailor mentions first: a swimming pool. 4 meters by 2 meters deep, heated, filled with fresh water or seawater, as the crew preferred. For a while, there was even a small menagerie aboard, parrots and canaries in cages, singing under the missile deck. The birds, it turned out, could not tolerate the dives. They were quietly retired, and the sailors kept a winter garden of plants instead. The crews nicknamed these boats the Floating Hiltons. Veterans add the corrective: by submarine standards, a palace; by any other standard, a steel pipe where you needed permission to use the sauna, and where in port, the swimming pool was used to store potatoes. One veteran put it best: the sacks of potatoes spent more time in that pool than we ever did. So why would a warship carry a sauna? Because of where it had to live. Earlier Soviet missile submarines had a miserable job. To reach their launch positions, they had to run the gauntlet of the North Atlantic, past NATO's listening posts, past the hunter submarines waiting in the gaps between Greenland, Iceland, and Britain. Many would not have made it. The Typhoon ended that game. Western analysts concluded that these boats were never meant to sneak across the Atlantic at all. They were built to disappear into the bastions, protected home waters in the Barents Sea and under the polar ice cap, guarded by the bulk of the Soviet attack fleet, by aircraft, by the geography of the Arctic itself, and simply wait. Wait through the crisis, wait through the first strike if it came, and then surface through the ice and answer it. The word bastion was never Moscow's, it was NATO's name for what it saw. But what it saw was real. A fortress with a roof made of ice, and the Typhoons were built to live under it. The R-39 could reach America from those waters, by some accounts from the pier itself. Each missile carried up to 10 warheads, 20 missiles, up to 200 warheads on a single boat, each one several times Hiroshima. That mission meant something brutal for the crew. 120 days at a time, sealed in steel, under an unbroken ceiling of ice. No surfacing, no mail, no sun. And so, perhaps for the first time in naval history, the designers treated comfort as a weapons requirement. The sauna wasn't luxury, It was ammunition for the mind. Picture the patrol itself. 4 months in a world with no day or night, only watch rotations. Above the hull, a ceiling of ice stretching to every horizon. Below it, black water and the long Arctic dark. The hum of the ventilation never changes. The drills never stop. Somewhere far above, the world is having a crisis or not having one, and 160 men wait to find out which kind of silence this is. And it worked. The boats went north, under the ice, and vanished. In trials, a Typhoon surfaced at the polar ice cap, shouldering aside ice 2.5 meters thick, reportedly closer to 3. Somewhere below the roof of the world, at any given moment, sat a building full of missiles, waiting. For 10 years, the Typhoons did exactly what they were designed to do, which is to say, nothing at all. Deterrence is a strange profession. Its greatest victories look identical to unemployment. In 1991, one of them came closer to disaster than almost anyone knew. Chapter 3. The Years of Service. September 27th, 1991. The White Sea. The submarine TK-17 is at launch depth, running a practice firing, a training missile with a dummy warhead. The countdown reaches its final seconds. According to later Russian accounts, the missile explodes inside its silo. The blast tears the silo lid off the deck and hurls the dummy warhead into the sea. 90 tons of solid fuel are burning in an open tube, and flaming propellant is pouring across the hull, setting the rubber skin of the submarine alight. 19 more missiles are sitting in the tubes alongside it. Live ones. The captain, Igor Grishkov, has seconds and no manual for this. He blows ballast and surfaces. The fire keeps burning. Solid fuel does not care about air. So Grishkov does the thing that sounds like madness and is exactly right. He takes the burning submarine back under the water, letting the sea wash the fire off his hull. Then he surfaces again, into silence and smoke. No one died. No radiation escaped. The boat was repaired, the damaged tube welded shut, and the incident simply disappeared, kept quiet for over 2 decades. Captain Grishkov was never decorated for it. The fleet he saved was already too poor for medals. He died in 2018, a retired officer of a country that no longer existed, famous to almost no one. It was the closest a Typhoon ever came to catastrophe, and it says everything about the machine's decade of service that the worst day involved a missile that wasn't even armed. The R-39 itself had earned its scars honestly. After the early test failures were beaten out of it, the missile served reliably for 20 years. At its peak, the force carried 120 of them, some 1,200 warheads, riding under the Arctic in 6 hulls. A 7th hull was begun at Severodvinsk and never finished. The plan had once spoken of 10 or 12. The country had other problems by then. For NATO, the Typhoons were a decade-long obsession. Attack submarines shadowed the bastion approaches, patrol aircraft seeded the sea with listening buoys, analysts pored over every satellite pass of Severodvinsk. Intelligence memos from those years, declassified now, track the boats hull by hull. Typhoon Unit 3, Typhoon Unit 5, probably an early stage of construction. The CIA watched every weld. What it could not see was the swimming pool. In the West, meanwhile, the Typhoon was having the opposite career. It was becoming the most famous submarine on Earth. In 1984, an unknown insurance agent named Tom Clancy published a novel about a Typhoon whose captain defects to America. The Hunt for Red October. Clancy had no classified sources. He built his submarine from public reference books and imagination, gave it 6 extra missile tubes and a silent caterpillar drive no real submarine has ever had. President Reagan called it the perfect yarn, and the book, and the film that followed, made the Typhoon a legend. Which is its own kind of irony. The most famous Soviet submarine in history was famous for something it never did, in a story written by the other side. And then, in December 1991, the country that built it signed itself out of existence. Chapter 4. The Starvation. Nobody ever defeated the Typhoons. What killed them was slower and stranger. They ran out of food. The R-39 missile had a shelf life. Solid fuel ages, electronics drift, warheads need maintenance. The factories that made the R-39 stood in a country dissolving into pieces, and production simply stopped. Year by year, the stockpile expired, until by 2004, the last R-39 was withdrawn. The largest missile submarines ever built had nothing left to fire. There was supposed to be a successor, a modernized missile, the R-39M called Bark, that would rearm the Typhoons for another generation. Bark flew 3 times. It failed 3 times. The third launch, in the late 90s, ended in an explosion a few hundred meters above the pad. If you have seen our film about the N-1 moon rocket, you know what a rocket can do to the machine built around it. But this time, the rocket didn't destroy the machine. It simply never arrived. The harvest failed. In 1998, with the program roughly 3/4 complete, the Russian Security Council cancelled Bark and handed the future to a small, light missile called Boulevard. 37 tons against the R-39's 84. Boulevard was sized for a new, smaller class of submarine, and that smaller submarine was being drawn at the same bureau in Leningrad by the same man. Sergei Kovalyov, who had designed every one of the giants, was now asked, in his 80s, to design the boat that would replace them. He did. He had spent his whole life answering. This time the question was his own machine. The decision made sense. It also meant something nobody said out loud. The Typhoons would never be rearmed. The cathedral had been built around columns that would never be replaced. The fleet they belonged to was dying anyway. At the Arctic bases, submarines waited years for fuel, for spares, for crews that hadn't been paid. One by one, the Typhoons stopped going to sea. By the end of the 90s, boats barely 15 years old, machines that had cost the Empire more than almost anything it ever built, sat motionless at their piers, reactors cold, missile tubes empty. The era produced one last image worthy of the machine. 1997, the Barents Sea. Under disarmament agreements, and according to Russian accounts of the disposal launches, the submarine TK-13 fired her entire complement. 20 missiles, launch after launch after launch. The sea boiled. With every launch, the boat rode higher in the water, lighter, emptier, firing the end of the world into designated disposal corridors where the missiles destroyed themselves. Her sister repeated the feat that same year. There was no enemy. There was no target. The only time a Typhoon ever did the thing it was built to do, at full power, all tubes, was as a way of throwing its weapons away. Like Buran's one perfect flight, the system's only full performance was its own retirement. A weapon is only a weapon while someone can afford it. After that, it is 25,000 tons of radioactive steel, moored next to a city, waiting. Russia could not afford to sail them. It turned out Russia could not even afford to scrap them. Chapter 5. The Funeral, paid in dollars. Dismantling a nuclear submarine is not demolition. It is surgery. The fuel must come out of 2 reactors. The hull must be cut around them. The reactor compartments must be sealed and stored. For decades. In the 1990s, Russia had neither the money nor, in places, the equipment to do it. The money came from the country the Typhoons had been built to destroy. Under an American program called Cooperative Threat Reduction, the Nunn-Lugar program, the United States paid to dismantle the arsenal of its former enemy. Not as charity, as insurance. In Washington, the nightmare was not the Typhoons sailing. The nightmare was the Typhoons rotting. 20 silos, 2 reactors, and a night watchman who hadn't been paid since spring. American specialists delivered equipment to the Arctic yards. An American-funded facility for unloading nuclear fuel rose at the shipyard next door to Sevmash. The brand new facility had one flaw. It could not handle a typhoon. The boats were too big even for their own funeral home. But the checks cleared. 3 of the 6 Typhoons, TK-202, TK-12, TK-13, went under the cutting torches through the 2000s, up to $10 million per boat, with America and Canada covering about 80% of the bill. What the torches could not destroy was stored. The reactor compartments, cut out whole, sealed, made buoyant, were towed up the coast to a bay near Murmansk, where they sit to this day in long, neat rows, a cemetery of steel cylinders, each one the heart of a ship that once carried up to 200 warheads. Some of the men holding the torches had built these hulls. The same hands, the same city, assembly in the world's largest shipbuilding hall, disassembly at the yard next door, on Western money. The city had built 6 sharks for the Empire. The Empire vanished, and the city was paid by the Empire's enemy to erase what it had built. In the whole Cold War, there is no other ending like it. The losers' monsters, buried at the winner's expense. Once America bought the dead Empire's rocket engines. Now it bought its graves. 3 were cut apart, but 3 survived. And one of them was about to get a second life, teaching Russia's next missile how to fly. Chapter 6. What remains? The first Typhoon ever built, TK-208, by then renamed Dmitry Donskoy, was rebuilt with a single working missile tube and spent its last 2 decades as a trials ship, a flying classroom for the Bulava, the very missile that had replaced its own. The old giant fired the new missile again and again, through failures and successes, and one of those failures wrote itself across the sky. In December 2009, a Bulava's 3rd stage spun out of control above the Arctic, and for a few minutes, an enormous glowing spiral hung over Norway, photographed by thousands, explained by no one that night, and briefly famous as a UFO. It was the old submarine's new missile, failing beautifully. The first Typhoon spent more years as a test rig than it ever spent on combat patrol. The old giant carrying the new missile, launch after launch, until the new submarines were ready to take it. Then it handed over the future, and the future did not need it anymore. Dmitry Donskoy outlived everything. In the summer of 2022, Russian media reported its retirement, prematurely as it turned out. The official decommissioning came in February 2023. More than 40 years after its first sea trials, the last Typhoon stopped sailing. Its 2 surviving sisters, Arkhangelsk and Severstal, have been lying at Severodvinsk for 2 decades, lashed side by side, missile hatches open to the sky, so that American satellites can verify the silos are empty. The boat named Arkhangelsk has already lost its name, handed to a brand new attack submarine in 2024. In Russia, even a name can be scrapped for parts. In 2025, after years of campaigning by veterans, a decision was announced. Dmitry Donskoy will become a museum ship in St. Petersburg. The conversion, defueling, cutting out the reactors, making a doomsday machine safe for schoolchildren, is expected to cost over 1 billion rubles, and as of this filming, it has not begun. Not everyone celebrated the decision. The environmentalist Alexander Nikitin, a former naval officer himself, put it with brutal honesty. Now this pile of scrap metal will be a monument to the USSR, a country which no longer exists. As for the man who designed them, Sergei Kovalyov kept working to the end. 92 submarines bear his signature. In his final years, he designed something else for the Arctic, ice-resistant platforms for drilling oil and gas. The waters his Typhoons were built to hide in, the fortress under the ice, became an energy field. His bastion became a business. He died in 2011 at 91, on the way to the hospital, still the chief designer. And the idea itself, the underwater giant, did not die with him. In 2022, Russia commissioned Belgorod. Longer than a Typhoon, though half the displacement, built to carry nuclear-armed underwater drones. A sister ship, Khabarovsk, touched the water in 2025. The giants are coming back, built once again in the same covered hall at Severodvinsk. Whether the country that builds them can afford them, that question has been asked before, and the answer is moored at a pier nearby, with its hatches open. So, what killed the largest submarines ever built? Not the enemy. The enemy paid for the funeral. Not the design never failed at sea. Nobody ever defeated the Typhoons. Everything that fed them simply quit. Their missiles, their money, their country. In our last film, a machine flew perfectly once, and it changed nothing. This time, the machine worked for 40 years, and the only war it ever fought was against its own supply chain. It lost. This has been Iron Curtain Industries. If you want the rest of this saga, the moon rocket killed by its engines and the space shuttle crushed by its own roof, those films are on screen now. Subscribe.